Jesuit Pope leading the church, and very exciting for us all in Jesuit higher education, and certainly in the program that I'm directing, because it gives us a new opportunity to look at leadership within our spiritual tradition and also new ways of understanding the church. And when Scott invited me to come and be part of this lecture series, I was very eager to participate, and we talked about what might be of interest to you. And at the time, Chris Lowney had just released this new book that we asked to get to you. And I thought, what a great opportunity for us, about a year into this pontificate, to engage a topic that is a person who is captivating the imagination of the world. Certainly people within the Catholic Church, but I think more importantly, people beyond the Catholic Church, international leaders, leaders of other faiths. So there's a great deal that we can learn from looking closely at how Pope Francis leads. So, this. I've never suffered from not being heard. But so I've been directing this program for 6 years, and prior to that, I was Associate Dean of the Graduate School. And along the way, I've been an advisor to the a cappella group here at John Carroll, the men's a cappella group, and to the ice hockey team. I've taught in the MBA classes. I've taught in our nonprofit management class. I've taught undergraduates in moral decision making. So I've really had a nice slice of life here at John Carroll University. And this is the first time I've had an opportunity to address alumni. So I'm really, really happy to be here. Okay? How many of you have had a chance to read chapter 4? Okay. How about the book? Page through the book yet? Okay, so what we're going to do tonight, we'll scratch the surface and hopefully whet your appetite. So what I'm going to do tonight is, much like Scott did, I'll give you a little bit of information about this topic. We'll stop and I'll give you an activity to do and you'll talk about it with one another. And I would like to get into a dialogue, all right, and not just talk at you for an hour and a half. So we'll do a mixture of activities. I've got 3 exercises to invite you to do and to talk about with one another. And we'll look at 4 of the 6 lessons of leadership that Chris Lowney has identified for Pope Francis, okay? Let's start out by just putting out on the table what you all are thinking when you hear about Pope Francis. What comes to mind when you think about Pope Francis? It doesn't have to do with leadership, just what comes to mind. Words, ideas, yes?
Helping people.
Helping people, great.
Humility.
Humility, good.
Jesuit.
Jesuit, yes?
It's about time.
It's about time, right? Great. Yes?
Devotion to the poor and concern about poor people.
Yes, devotion to and concern for the poor people. Very Jesuit, right?
Rattling the cage.
Rattling the cage, how so? Just
by little things he's done, like when he became Pope, paying for his room,
yep.
Riding in Ford Focus, just kind of shunning the trappings of the popistry.
Yes, right. You know, I was at an event about 4 months ago. It was a bunch of Jesuits in the room with lay people who are kind of in the know, people that work in mission identity. And someone gave an exercise, the director gave an exercise, said, where were you when you first, where were you and what did you think when Pope Francis was announced? And you know, we went around the room, and some of the interesting things that I heard from among these Jesuits were, if I can remember correctly, some would say, it can't be. Can't be a Jesuit. They're crazy. Whoever said that, you know, if they didn't hear it themselves and someone said it directly, they said no. The next would be, it couldn't be him. He's too old. He might have been considered in the previous election, but everyone forgot about him, and he wasn't one of the people that folks were saying. Others said, oh, well, actually, they said, oh, shit. Now, I can say that because I counted Scott Allen said that word about 5 times in the first week. I don't know how many times he did in the next one, so they're going to have to edit these, right? But say, oh, no, really? This guy was not friendly to us all. You know, he was not, you know, when he was, he kind of got a bad rap. as a provincial and as a bishop in Argentina. So, you know, he was, people were like, oh gosh, what are we getting? But, like, that's when they heard it. But then when they saw what happened, their opinions started to change pretty radically. How many of you remember seeing the first day, anything from the first day of his pontificate on TV? What do you remember seeing? What comes to mind?
You mean elected or actually?
Right when he was elected. So, you know, when he came out on the balcony, right? Or within the next day. You know, that first 24 hours. Did you want to say? No. Oh, Lisa, did you want to say something? Yeah.
No, wasn't he humble when he was checking into his hotel or whatever? He didn't stay at the usual.
Right. He didn't want to stay at the usual place. He wanted to stay where he had been staying, the simple apartments.
I remember when he made his acceptance speech, he said, "Pray for me."
Yeah.
Versus, "I'll pray for all of you." Immediately he said,
yeah.
"I'm not perfect."
And not to engage in semantics, but I didn't realize this. I would have said exactly what you said, but someone who is smarter than me said, no, you know what they said in Latin? It was, pray over me. Pray over me. Not pray for me. When we say, I'm sick, pray for me, right? So pray for me, intercess for me. But he said in either Spanish or Italian, it translates into pray over me, which is something priests do. So he asked the people early on to pray over me, which is a very humble, who is it who said humility? Humble act that turns the tables, you know. So immediately we see the Pope doing things new. One of the interesting things I thought of when I heard them, when he picked the name Francis, was immediately I remembered from I used to teach in a Franciscan school, and St. Francis of Assisi was reputed for saying, preach at all times, use words when necessary. Preach at all times, use words when necessary. What does that translate into with regard to leadership? Yes?
Actions speak louder than words.
Actions speak louder than words. Lead by example, right? Exactly. So, and the other thing that's interesting about Francis, the selection, this is the first, you know, this is a Pope of firsts, right? So Francis is the first person from the Americas, Latin America, and he's the first person to choose the name Francis, and he's the first Jesuit. Do you know who the saint that Saint Ignatius Loyola wanted to emulate when he was undergoing his conversion? Francis of Assisi. So like the founder of the Jesuits, Bishop Bergoglio wanted to emulate the great Saint Francis of Assisi, who was known as a reformer in the church, who led by example and who cared for the poor. Okay, so Cardinal Bergoglio was, you know, when he chose that name, he was very intentional about who he chose. So we're going to talk about that. So in my background, this is exciting, you know. And Chris Lowney has written a number of books. He's written this book. It's called Heroic Leadership. I actually used it in my MBA class one year in order to do two things at one time: to teach people about teach people in the MBA program about the Jesuit Ignatian tradition, but also to draw lessons in leadership from it. And I just want to. Chris Lowney, if you haven't read his bio in the current book, he's a former Jesuit who left before he got ordained, and so he's in formation for many years. He left and he became a businessman at J.P. Morgan, and he climbed the ranks, and along the way what he realized, and he was very successful in both worlds, but along the way he realized many of the lessons that he had learned as a Jesuit and the ways of being a leader were operative in his life as a leader at J.P. Morgan. So he had this insight to kind of track what he called the leadership inherent in the Ignatian way of proceeding, and he calls it heroic leadership. So let me just read a couple of the pieces of wisdom that he sees from within the leadership tradition, and you'll see it in today's presentation in this book as you read it. Just 4 brief points. So 4 differences, he writes, stand out for Jesuit leadership. 1, and this is, I think this is a great way of looking at leadership. 1, we're all leaders, and we're leading all the time, either well or poorly. We're all leaders, and we're leading all the time, either well or poorly. So, if you're a parent, if you have responsibilities at work, if you're a teacher, if you are someone who has actual leadership in your title and responsibilities, we're leading all the time. And we can either do it well or poorly. Second, leadership springs from within. It's about who I am as much as what I do. So leaders are oftentimes known more for their character traits than their accomplishments. And we've talked about some of that in our first couple lessons. Next, leadership is not an act, it is my life, a way of living. And fourth, I never complete the task of becoming a leader, it's an ongoing process. So this Ignatian way of understanding leadership that Chris Lowney adopts here is to recognize that we're always, that leadership is something that comes from within. We're always leading, and it's an ongoing process. And if you look at the way the Jesuits have always been structured, as an order, they go through this long formation process, and we'll talk about that today, because it's that process that Lowney is suggesting has prepared Pope Francis and other Jesuits to lead the way he does. It's a long process of formation. And this book is about what the Pope did before he became Pope more than it is about what he's doing as Pope. All right. So what I like about this is this means that if you believe this understanding of leadership, then you recognize that all of us have something to learn. Because we're either leading well or we're leading poorly. And what does he understand leadership to be? But he understands 4 pillars of leadership. One is Jesuits became leaders by 1, understanding their strengths and weaknesses, so self-awareness. 2 is innovating and adapting in a changing world. 3, engaging others with a positive, loving attitude, so empowering other people to use their gifts in a loving way. And 4, energizing themselves through heroic ambitions, so dreaming big dreams, looking at a situation, seeing that something needs to be done, and the Jesuit way of leading is not just to do the least that they can do, but do the best they can do, to do the most good thing that they can do, and that's something that we call the magis here, right? So I just wanted to mention those 4 pillars and those 4 ways of understanding leadership that are inherent to the Ignatian way, the way that Jesuits understand leadership. And you'll see that in this presentation. So there's a consistency to his work. And the reason I think that all of this is really important for us here at John Carroll to understand, and for you alumni to understand, who want to be involved in lifelong learning, is that if leadership development is something ongoing that we're always doing, then there's an opportunity for us to grow in our leadership and to be aware of how we're leading and how we might lead better and more effectively, okay? So what we're going to do today is we're going to look to see, how Chris Lowney talks about Pope Francis, all right? So here we go. All right, crisis in leadership. According to Chris Lowney, in all 3 of these books, he says we don't trust our leaders today. They're not people of integrity. Our public figures seem superficial, fake, and inauthentic. When we look at the heroes and heroines on TV, our children are being asked to emulate leaders who are really corrupt and really inauthentic people. Globally, there's distrust. So different surveys, the Edelman survey in 24 countries suggests that 18% of the people trust business leaders to tell the truth. And only 13% trust government leaders to tell the truth. So do you agree with this assessment? Do you think we have a crisis of leadership in America today? How would you explain it? Or cite it?
Spinelessness of our president in the Russian situation seems to be apparent that he doesn't know which way to go.
Okay.
Doesn't know which way to push him.
Lack of backbone, which translates into a lack of courage in some of our leaders. Yeah.
A lot of times it's also lack of direction. Is that leaders, they're going in different. They like say one thing, and then they're going in a different direction when you see when they're actually putting forth what they said.
Right.
So then you're trying to figure out which direction that they're trying to take us.
They say one thing and do another, right? How do they determine the thing that they want to say they're going to do?
What's going to get them elected?
Yes.
Yeah.
Polls. I agree with the premise that there is a crisis of leadership. And where does that happen? Where do people learn leadership? Where do people learn leadership today? From other leaders, so from what they see. Where might young people learn leadership today? From their parents.
In school.
Where in school? Where in school?
In everything. I mean, leaders just kind of surface in a classroom.
Yeah.
Any classroom, every classroom.
Sure. There are silent leaders and actual leaders in classrooms. What's that?
Where they're working.
Where they work. Student athletes get to learn through sports. What you need?
Coaches.
Through coaches. Some coaches are good. Some coaches are good examples of leadership. Some coaches are not. Okay, so crisis of leadership. Oh, yes, please. Oh, please. Absolutely.
Back up for a second. Do you think that the crisis in leadership is a new thing? Because I'm a child, politically aware
Right.
in the 70s, and we're talking Watergate and distrust.
Right.
And if you were to run that poll or that type of poll and going back in time, do you think it was ever any better?
I think it would be naive to say it was ever a lot better, like to think back of the good old days. No, I think this is a crisis of leadership that we've inherited, because the way I understand leadership is something that becomes part of our culture. So I think we're seeing maybe the exaggerated results of bad leadership that we've inherited. Now, there have always been good leaders, and there have always been exemplary, heroic people that do good things and have led us through times of crises. So, but I think there is a sense, though, that because of globalization and the spread of technology and sensationalization in the media, that this crisis is becoming more urgent because the needs are becoming more urgent, and also the rapid exchange of information has made it difficult.
Also, I think we see our elected officials thinking they're winning power. Mm-hmm. And they go into office and they realize they don't have as much power as they think they should have. They really don't know how to handle anything. And I don't think you could really learn how to be president of the United States until you are. It's not something, there's a book on how to be the president of the United States. And so I think that it's all a learning experience, and hopefully by the time you get up there, I can't imagine why anyone would want to be president.
Right,
But they consider it a winning of power. They try to get people to vote from the blue states, the red states, they win something.
Right.
It's not an Oscar.
Yeah.
It's a service to the people. That's what I liked about this Pope Francis. I'm not here as a powerful leader.
Right.
I'm here as a humble servant. And I think he's giving a lesson to elected officials out there who I don't even think of themselves like that.
Yep. Yeah, and I think one of the other things that's happened over the decades is, and one of the things that people decry recently is the lack of civic discourse in our society. Even within our government. I'm not going to say things were perfect 50 and 100 years ago, because of course there was corruption. But it used to be, as I understand it, and I listen to my, people that know more about politics than I do, it used to be that Democrats and Republicans, they would always have opposition and conflict, but at the end of the day, there was some fundamental level of respect for one another and for the offices that they've held, so that they could engage in, they could disagree civilly, and that seems to be missing today. And I think that is a crisis of leadership. The cult of personality and the degradation of personalities has been, I think, contributing to this crisis. So, yes, please.
I think part of it is society and leadership in government corporations is it's the all about me attitude.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care about you, it's all about me. It's all about how much money I can get, how much fame I can get, how much recognition I can get, and to heck with you. As long as I'm happy and I have the money and I have everything, who cares about you? It's all about me.
So remember that, because we're going to come. I want to come back to that. All right. So because I agree, and you'll see it embedded in what we do later. So the premise of this book is, and Lowney lays this out for us, is that leaders act on beliefs and convictions formed long before they enter the executive office, or in this case, the papal apartments. That when someone arises to an official leadership position, how they act in that position for good or ill is formed in what happened a long time ago. And that it takes practice. And for me, this is why it's important that we look at, well, how do good leaders become good leaders? It isn't overnight. It's not automatically because you get the office. But, if you look at, when we talked earlier about Pope Francis, immediately he did things very differently. And we don't know, but he probably had some sense. He could probably, in the conclave, tell that the tide was turning in his direction, and certainly he might have had some time to think about, well, what will I do? And perhaps he would have thought about, how would I lead, last time when Benedict XVI was elected. He might have started thinking, well, I'm a candidate, really, in this election, so I may actually get chosen, so how would I lead? But I think the reality is this was pretty spontaneous. His actions, there was a spontaneity to them, but they flowed from who he was and who he has long been. So what Lowney tries to do in this book is to look back at the Pope's earlier life and to see how was he as a leader before. And what did he do in his life that seems to be preparing him for what he's doing now? So, and if that's true, then we ought to care deeply about the lessons of leadership that our students here at John Carroll get. We ought to care about who their teachers are, who their coaches are, what their activities are. We ought to invest a lot of resources in helping them understand leadership properly, because if we want to send people out into the world to lead and serve, then we need to be intentional about it. It's not going to happen automatically, So everyone should take Scott Allen's classes as an undergraduate, right? So if you believe this, that leadership is something that's cultivated through habitual practice early on, then as parents you have to pay attention to the kind of things your kids are doing and learning. And then as educators in high school and college, you have to be concerned about what opportunities students are having to learn leadership well or not. And then as employers and people who are entering into the workforce responsible for your own leadership formation, we ought to pay close attention to it. Okay? So in the book, there are 6 what I call paradoxical lessons, certainly for the church, but I would argue for the world. The interesting thing about the Ignatian Jesuit way of proceeding is it's very humanistic. You know, it's certainly rooted in a belief of God, it's rooted in the belief that the Spirit of God animates people and is at work in the world and is penultimately realized in the person of Jesus and the way He led and lived in the world. But it's also radically human. So we believe that these lessons can be recognized and embraced by anyone, regardless of their religious belief. Now, you can agree or not with that. So the 6 lessons, and they're called paradoxical because they're matched in pairs because they seem contradictory. All right, so it seems like those 2 things that hang together are not mutually reinforcing. But in fact, they are. And we'll look at them, for example. So the first lesson is to know, accept, and love yourself. And yourself is always a flawed self. None of us are perfect, including the Pope. So to know yourself is to know that you're flawed. We'll see. So to know, accept, and love yourself. But, this is the paradox, live to serve others. So it seems, you know, if you love yourself, you can't be so preoccupied with yourself, but you have to love other people. You have to live for other people, to serve others. So that's one pair. Next is you have to immerse yourself in the world or in the work, but you have to withdraw from it periodically or daily. So roll up your sleeves, get busy at work, immerse yourself, lose yourself in the work, but not so much so that you can't step back from it to see what's going on. Paradoxical. Last set, and those are the 2 that we're going to look at these 2 tonight if time moves, if we can get to them. I don't have enough time to do the last, okay? But you'll see the pattern. I'll just mention them. Live in the present and revere tradition, but create the future. Right? So, and hopefully when you start to think about what Pope Francis has done, you can see him doing some of this. And that's what we'll do in the book here. Okay? So let's look at the first lesson. Maybe. Here we go. Self-knowledge and loving acceptance of our flawed selves. I'm kind of conflating words here, right? So self-knowledge. You might remember from my expose on Chris, this book here, his first pillar of leadership is self-knowledge, right? So self-knowledge is kind of a core foundation for good leaders and also for Jesuits. So let me just talk to you about, let's leave the spiritual stuff behind. How do leaders gain self-knowledge? How do leaders gain self-knowledge? And remember, all of us are leading all the time. Dan?
Listening to others' observations about themselves.
Sure. Formally and informally, right? So what's a formal way of listening to others' observations of us as workers?
Quarterly review at work, for example.
Yep, absolutely. What are some other ways we gain self-knowledge? Ed?
Mistakes you made in the past.
Learning from mistakes. And how do you uncover those mistakes?
You're asking how do you...
Yeah, like how do those, like, what happens? How do you learn from those mistakes?
Sometimes it's a negative outcome.
Yep.
You realize it's a mistake and you don't want to repeat it.
Right, you don't want people, so you dig into it, right? You reflect on it. Good. So we learn from our mistakes, we learn from what other people tell us. What are some other formal ways that we might do it?
Evaluate performance.
Evaluate your performance. And who generally does that? Supervisor? Your peer-to-peer evaluation. It could be a supervisor's evaluation. If you were to pay a consultant to come in, how might they achieve self-awareness and self-knowledge for workers?
They'll ask your colleagues about you.
Yeah, so maybe a 360 evaluation, right? Or Myers-Briggs, someone might come in and do some Myers-Briggs typing, or whole brain thinking, or strengths assessment. So if you go to Barnes & Noble, there's probably 20 books about self-knowledge, right? How to gain self-knowledge in business. Because they realize that you have to be aware of who you are. And one of the, I think, spiritual realities, but it also makes sense to us, self-knowledge is made difficult because we have a built-in tendency to be blind to our faults. I think Scott, did Scott use the word scotosis in his presentation, or is that something I made up because it was in another presentation? Right, he didn't, I did. All right, so scotosis is a natural human tendency to be blind to our failings or to our shortcomings. You know, so if we're honest with ourselves, we don't always immediately get where we're flawed. So we need other people to point it out to us. We need to look at our mistakes and look closely and realize it was our fault or we had something to do with it. We have to invest in other people helping us. So self-knowledge usually comes by other people working with us. Well, in the Jesuit tradition, this self-knowledge comes in many ways, but primarily through the spiritual exercises. Because the spiritual exercises are designed to help Jesuits find out who they are most deeply. And anyone else that wants to engage in them, they're really for the church. So someone who participates in the spiritual exercises engages in a process of coming to know themselves, to know where they're least free and where there's disorder in their life and how to overcome it. The earliest title for the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius went something like this. These are spiritual exercises to overcome oneself and order one's life. To overcome oneself and order one's life. Basically, it's like you have to get over yourself, right? So part of what leaders have to do is get over themselves. We have to get over ourselves in order to get out of the way. So, but unfortunately, what happens in the kind of contemporary literature is that the self-knowledge can become like navel-gazing, where we're picking apart our imperfections. And we say, oh, I'm really not a good leader because I'm incapable of doing this, that, and the other thing, and I've got these flaws that everyone seems to be pointing out to me. But obviously, self-knowledge should illuminate our gifts and our strengths, our hopes and our dreams, as well as our shortcomings and our failings, and the things we just can't do well, right? All of us do some things well, and other things not so well. It's no crime to not do something well. If I can't think spatially, that's not a big deal. As long as I get if I know that, and then I invite someone to be part of my team that helps me think spatially. That's my wife. So when we're doing anything in the house, decorating the house, moving furniture, rebuilding, we redesigned a couple rooms in my wife would start talking about, well, let's do this and flip this wall and do that. And I'm like, I can't follow you. I was an engineer in my former life, so I'm smart with all that stuff, but I cannot get visual stuff. I can't take an image and flip it over in my mind, but she can do that really easily. So I'll have to slow her down, tell her to write it. Or if an architect comes in and starts talking to us about knocking down this wall and running these pipes this way and doing that, I say, don't talk to me, talk to her. Because I can't see what you're talking about. I've got no idea. My brain doesn't work that way. So self-knowledge is good. Knowing where you're not strong, you can get people to help you with that. Right? The danger is when we're unaware of it and we act as if we do know how to think spatially, if I do know how to think spatially, or if I am good at something I'm not really good at. So this first lesson for us is to somehow become aware of our strengths and weaknesses and to embrace it, to love it, and to do our best to overcome it. So, if I discover that I have this really, bad flaw that's harmful, I had to try to overcome it. And it might be something I always have to, if I'm short-tempered, You know, I'll have to realize that when I'm tired and stressed, I'm probably always going to need 3 minutes to just have a timeout before I solve a problem. And I may always have to deal with that, but at least hopefully I will know. I'll try to compensate for it. But if I'm unaware of it and I just kind of plow through life and cause harm because of my short-temperedness or my short-sightedness, then I can have problems. But if I know who I am and know my limitations and I accept it, there's freedom in that. And then I can be the type of leader who brings other people onto my team to complement where I'm not strong. Sometimes when we look at ourselves, we ask, what's challenging about loving ourselves? You know, we have to ask, are we comfortable in our own skin? Or do we shed it regularly? These are some images that I'm stealing from Alumni, okay? So he says, part of the problems with inauthentic leaders today is that they seem to change whenever they need to change. So these are the people that tell you what you want to know. They change their appearance, okay? Or do you hold beliefs that remain true to yourself, or do you change who you are in order to blend in? Are you a person of conviction and principle, and they stay with you through tough times? Or do you kind of change the way that, do you change according to your environment? You know, are you like a chameleon who tries to blend in? Are you overly interested in pleasing other people or being accepted? You know, is it important, is that getting that job or that position, that elected position, so important to you that you're willing to change who you appear to be in order to blend in with the crowd? Or will you be a person of conviction who stands for what you believe? So all that. So here's, I think, a really powerful quote. Last thing I want to share before I give you an exercise. Leaders who don't know themselves or aren't true to themselves can't lead effectively because they have forfeited what should be a leader's most powerful tool: integrity, the power of personal example, inviting us to follow. The power of personal example, inviting us to follow. Bless you. I tried to think of some practical examples from my own life of this stuff. So this goes back to the time I was, 16 or 18 years old. I used to work for a health club, and it was a family-owned business that grew back in the 80s. It grew during the health club craze, and it went from being this small tennis club to a tennis and racquetball club to a tennis, racquetball, and fitness club, and it just kept growing and growing. So there's this dynamic family that I think were innately good leaders. And here's a lesson in leadership I learned from this person, from the owner. The owner's name was Zoe Veazey. She and her husband Ed owned the club, but she was really the one who drove it. And her family worked there. Is a family business. And one day, I rode my bike to work, and the bike rack is in one part of the property. And I got there early because my job was to sweep the tennis courts. And so there's this giant parking lot filled up, and I noticed that the owner, Zoe, who drove a station wagon, parked in the back of the parking lot. And she walked through the parking lot and picked up trash. And no one else is around, and I'm looking at in the corner. So she wasn't doing it. But she picked up trash all along the way. And then I noticed that everywhere she went, no matter what she was doing, she would stop and pick up trash. And then I realized that in the spring, when it came time for us to lay out the clay tennis courts, which is a horrible, I don't know if you've ever seen this done or done it, but imagine 12 clay tennis courts, and each of them has a set of tapes that are rolled up all winter long, and they have to be spread out, painted. You have to line the courts, you have to put guidelines down, then you have to take all these tapes out, stretch them out, paint them, nail them down, put up wind screens, paint, put up the nets. Then there's the giant pool that has to be scrubbed, sandblasted, rolled, painted. Well, she and all of her family are out there doing that every year. So this is someone who leads by example, and I always remembered that. Here's a woman who paid people to pick up the trash on the property, but she purposely parked at the far end of the property and walked all the way in and picked up any trash she saw. And that always made an impression on me, that here's someone, and it relates to one of these other things, but she leads by example. And guess what? She expected every employee, I found out, to pick up trash. And everyone did. As I got to be part of the organization, I noticed that all the managers, everyone, if they walked by, picking up trash, cleaning up a bathroom was everyone's job in the building, if it needed to be done. Of course, there are maintenance workers and all that. So leading by example. But if you don't know yourself, and if you're not true to yourself, if you're a chameleon, or if you shed your skin, if you're a reptilian leader, then you don't have integrity. You can't lead by example, because who you are changes all the time. All right? So who you are and what you're about is of utmost importance. And what I want to do right now is to stop and invite you to think about who you are and what motivates you. So I'm going to ask to pass these out. I'm going to pass these out and ask you to take one, pass them around. I'll go here. Thanks. Let's see if we get something like that. So I'd ask you just to do we're going to do the first exercise. I think I have this down here. Okay, so who you are and what you believe. Does anyone need one? Oh, pens? Oh, thanks. So if self-awareness is important, then we have to think about, I think if we're all leading all the time, then what we believe has something to do with who we are, and who we are has something to do with how we lead. So I'd like to give you a few minutes to do what Cardinal Bergoglio did before he was ever Pope, which is to write down what he truly believes. So I'm going to ask you to share this in groups of 3 after you do this. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes. But basically what I'm going to ask you to do is 3 or 4 sentences or bullet points, however you want to do it. Write down some fundamental principles of philosophy, some abiding values and non-negotiables for you. And maybe even a catchphrase that embraces who you are in your flawed self, as a human being or as a leader, however you want to engage it. And I say in a spirit of true humility. Someone mentioned a characteristic of Pope Francis as being humble. And you all know what false humility is, right? Have you ever encountered someone you would say is being false humbly? Someone's a great pianist, and you say, "Wow, you're so amazing." "Oh, no, I'm not that good." "Well, yes, you are. Are you telling me I'm not a good judge of piano playing?" No, they don't know how to accept the compliment, right? So humility, the root word for humility is humus, meaning earthly, of the earth. So to be humble is to be down to earth about yourself. And to be honest about what you're good at, and to be able to say what you're good at, what you're gifted at, and not to be apologetic about it. To recognize that it's a giftedness and something that makes you distinctly who you are. But in a spirit of humility, you also don't overreach. You know where your limits are. So a really humble person will be able to, when asked, say, "Well, my gifts are this. You know, I can do these things, but these other things are not they're not my strengths. And my weaknesses, or the areas I'm not so strong in, are this. And I'll tell you that. And so when you're in the presence of a truly humble person, it's not that they're not talented and capable, it's just that there's this kind of self-awareness that I can do this well, but that's not so much, right? So in a spirit of true humility, right, come down with your credo, your belief. Credo is I believe. You know, what is it you believe about yourself? What is it you believe about the way you can lead? What are your non-negotiable principles? What are the values that you never want to compromise, regardless of the background that you're in? Okay? Give you 3 or 4 minutes to do that, and then I'll ask you to share it with someone. Could someone just give an example from your discussion? What does it look like to serve other people in the work environment? Yes, please, Lisa.
Be open to them and encourage them.
Okay. Be opening and encouraging to others? Yes.
I think for me, the most important thing when you're the leader is to not ask others to do things that you would not do.
Right.
To do them and show them that you're doing them.
Yes.
I mean, we were talking, for example, there's me and 4 staff people, and we share a common fax machine. We all have work coming off of the copier. So when I go to the copier, what do? I get everybody's work and I pass it out. You don't leave it out there.
Right.
Because why? And everyone is equal in my job. And I really try to encourage them that, you know, you're the leader. Because I'm not the leader. You really are. And I tell them that, and I show them how to do things and empower them to do that work.
Now, can you do that all the time?
Yes.
Okay. There's a fine line to walk, because you also have to do some things that other people can't do.
Right, absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So,
I mean, when I say all the time, overall all the time.
Yeah.
Because there are times when I have to, I was just telling Rachel, that I have to do what I have to do.
Right.
Because it has to be done, because there are these reports.
Right.
However, even on those most busy days, I do always check in with my staff and say, how are you doing? Is there anything I can help you with? How's it going? Just to let them know that I'm still in touch with the real world, if you will.
Right. And if there's a case when you have to ask someone to do something because you have to do something else, and they know, well, she's done this before, or she would do this before, right? So there's a way to be in the workplace where people understand, because you've done stuff like this before that you're asking them to do, then it's not beneath you. Good. Yes, please, Carol.
I think piggyback for what you just said, and we were talking about an open door policy for supervisors, so you can go in, maybe something new, you can kick it around, da-da-da. And among coworkers, the same sort of thing, you know.
Sure.
I've never handled this before. How would you do this?
Right.
You know?
To ask for people for help.
And I think to have a sharing environment is what leaders should encourage in the workplace.
Right. Good. What else? One more? Yes, please.
Let your employees or workers know that you're available for any questions, or, you know, if you need help with something, you can come to you.
Absolutely. And to make yourself available and to be approachable. And also to let people know that you are behind what the organization is doing. That if it's a service organization, that you're out there in front helping people, and that you're committed to that as well. The other thing, I think, is to find ways to let other people shine. You know, if you're the leader who always wants to be in the spotlight, who always wants to get recognized for having things done, then, you know, you're going to be the person out front. But if you are the type of person who looks to empower other people to be successful on something and then to give them the credit they're due, that's great. You know, that's an other-oriented person. That makes sense? You know, I'm shortening this a little bit because of time. Here's lesson 3, and this is an important one. It's immerse yourself in the world's joys and suffering. Now, this is what the Pope does. Immerse yourself in the world's joys and sufferings. Another way is to get engaged in the world, especially at the rough spots. Okay? So come down off your pedestal, get out of your office, get out of the papal apartments, and be with the folk who are doing the stuff. at least periodically, all right? Yes, you have a unique job to do that you get paid to do and that perhaps you're capable, that you're responsible for doing. So you can't always, you know, Zoe couldn't always be picking up the trash. She couldn't be going around emptying the barrels every hour because she had to, she had to do the high-level executive stuff, supervising employees and managing the club and doing purchasing and managing the books and all that. So there are things that she had to do. But she periodically would unroll the court tapes and paint them and nail them down in her jeans and sweatshirt and scrape the old paint off and put the new paint on and then go in and shower up and have a board meeting later at night. Okay? So immerse yourself in the world's joys and sufferings. Here's an endangered leadership habit according to Alumni. Right? This is endangered. The commitment to stay in touch, to deal with reality, accept accountability for one's work and decisions for when we fail or when we're successful, and to recognize that all people are inextricably linked, both locally, community, and globally. So to live in the real world, to get real, to be real, that's the call of leadership. All right? Now, this comes home to us in an interesting way when we think about the Pope, okay? When he was rector of the seminary, he used to feed the pigs. They had to keep a farm in order to feed the folk in the seminary, and one of his jobs as rector was to feed the pigs. So Alumni refers to his feces-covered boots as his leadership footwear, because he showed his seminarians, who he sent out into the world to be among the people, that he too was ordinary folk and was not beneath tending to the pigs so that they could all eat. So, and this was back in his past. So what do we see him do as Pope? He goes out among the people, and he is with them. And you've seen the pictures, I don't have this one, but he's with the ordinary people. He's with people who are suffering. He's with people who are joyful. The image of the young child coming up and wrapping himself around the Pope during a lecture and saying, no, that's fine, just leave it. Or embracing the man who is very disfigured, has a horrible skin condition, and wheelchair bound, and the Pope embracing him tenderly. Is that a gimmick? No, the man used to feed pigs and walk in pig poop, okay? It's part of the fabric of who he is. So here's an Ignatian exercise would be to use your senses. What do you think this man smells? What do you think this man smells like? What does this man smell like? Like the sheep. Here's a shepherd. He will be known by his sheep because he is among his sheep and he bears the smell of his sheep. This is an image that the Pope used when talking to his priests. He said, folks, we have a problem. We are too anesthetized. We don't smell like our sheep. We don't smell like our flock. A good shepherd is known to his sheep because he spends time with his sheep and he protects them, but he spends time with them and he smells like them. Think about that. Do we who lead others smell like the others we lead? Do we spend enough time with them? Do they know us because we've been in their midst? Do they trust us because we have been among them and protected them and led them? Powerful imagery. So when and this is something, the Pope said this, but the Pope does this. All right? Let's see. I'd like to tell a quick story from my own past. I was, as an undergraduate, as a high school student, I was really good in math and science, and I grew up in the 80s, and what they did to anyone that had my profile was said, oh, you should be an engineer. So I went off, and I was going to be an engineer, and I was the first one in my family to go off to study, and I worked at this health club for a long time, and then one day my dad said, you know, Ed, you've had this cushy existence, cleaning toilets and scraping pools and laying out tennis courts all the time and sweeping them at 5 o'clock in the morning. But so that you got to put that cushy existence beside, because if you really want to be a good engineer, then and this is my dad, who himself was a technician, and he was a machinist all his life, and he worked for engineers anyway. So he said, if you really want to be a good engineer, you know what you should do this summer? He said, you should go work at a machine shop. I said, really? And he goes, yeah. And so I said, okay. So I went and I got a job at a machine shop. And it was a metal fabrication shop in Wilmington, Massachusetts. And I basically, long story short, found out in the first week that I wore the same pair of jeans almost the whole time I worked there. Because they just got filled with oil and file clippings. So I found I was running through jeans. So I had like 2 or 3 set of jeans that just were always dirty, that I always wore. And the same thing, I had just a couple shirts that I had to wear all the time. And I worked in a metal fabrication shop on 2 or 3 different machines, where all day long I had a basket of 1,000 pieces here. I took them out, put them on a machine, pressed a button, the machine came down, took all the burrs off them, I took them up and put them back in the basket. All day long. Grease, oil, filings everywhere. Hard work, moving pallet from here to there, diesel fumes everywhere. We all looked and smelled the same. We ate lunch, but I got to know all of the machinists. And they all got to know me. And first they didn't want to have anything to do with me because I was this, skinny little runt who was going out, college kid slumming here in the machine shop. But I got to know them, and they got to know me, and I'm kind of a likable person. So eventually they kind of said, oh, they got to know me, and I got to know them, and I got to know what they didn't like about engineers who had no idea on how to make parts and what happened to them, and they would design parts that couldn't fit in the machines, and et cetera, et cetera. So for a whole summer, I got to know what it was like to work on a floor. Fast forward 5 years when I got to work in a plant, I felt so comfortable working with the other fellow eggheads in the office, but also I could leave the office and go talk to the people on the floor and listen to their complaints and their concerns about design problems, and no one's help. So engineers designed this and it can't be built, and the people on the floor have to fix everything. So, but I got to know the culture of the people from doing that work. So in one sense, I smelled like a machinist, and I understood the work because I was involved in it, and that served me very well in the field. So there's another exercise, exercise 2. We'll just take a couple minutes to do this. We're not going to get to the third one, but that's something you can do at home. Just think for a minute to yourself. What's your leadership footwear? Where have you engaged the real in your life? Where have you paid your dues? Where could you if you haven't? So the Pope wore pig boots. I wore jeans filled with iron filings and oil as an engineer. Just think about it for yourself. What's your pathway to being real? What has grounded you and kept you real? Or what might? Leader who, are you the type of leader who stays in her or his office and looks at the organization from below who has really no connection and is known as such? Or are you the type of person who somehow bears the smell, the taste, and the feel of the people and the business that you're involved in? Significant difference. Significant difference. And I think we all know leaders that are like either one of those cases. So another lesson here from the Pope. Kneeling alone, withdraw and find perspective. So on the one hand, leave your office, get down there and get busy. Make sure that you're in touch with the work that's going on. But don't get so involved in it that you can't step back to take a look at, why is there so much damn trash around here? Maybe we don't have the right number of barrels in the right places, okay? So this idea, this metaphor of kneeling alone, like pulling back. Why is it necessary? Well, if you look at the pace, the volume, the complexity and the volatility of our work, you know, we're destined to fail. If you add on to this the mass number of emails and forms of communication that we're responsible for, downsizing, right-sizing, consolidation, budget reductions, doing more with less, we're just totally challenged. All right? So there's a conspiracy to raise stress, and it's happening unmanageably. We can get completely overwhelmed and mired in work. When that happens, our ability to think clearly and make decisions is eroded. We are distracted. We lose focus. We're not clear-headed. This is really a threat to our well-being and our health. The stress that can be created by the overwhelming load of work that can be done really is, undermining our health, and it's adversely affecting our leaders. 40% of all workers feel overworked and stressed to the point of depression. You know, argue with the statistic if you will, but tell me that the work environment is not filled with stress. Right? It is really filled with stress. And so, yes, you have to get out there and be with the folk and get engaged in the work, but you can't just be one of the worker bees. You can, because the work is endless. So if you're a good leader, you'll do what? Delegate, right? You should delegate, right? Rather than micromanage, you can delegate. What do you do with the extra time that you free up? More work, right? Find new work to do, sure. And then you delegate. So, so you might, delegation requires trust in the proper use of authority. But what do you do at that time? You probably fill it. Or do you, as Harvard Business School recommends in one of their articles, step back and take a look to gain a new perspective, to reflect? One of the quotes I stole from Alumni, these days what managers desperately need is to stop and think and to stop and step back, to take a break from the craziness of it all and to look at patterns of behavior and to ask how we can do this differently. To really disengage from the very work that we said you should be engaged with. You know, and that is a distinctive feature of the Ignatian style, is to be reflective. And interestingly, it's almost counterintuitive that the busier you are, to find some way to stop and to take a few minutes to think. You might say, well, I won't get much done. I could be doing more in that time. But in a counterintuitive way, we know from our spiritual tradition, and I think people who know good human behavior, is that if you step back, you actually can be more productive and have more time. Right? So here's something I like from, again, this is from Lonnie. Francis de Sales, a 17th century French bishop, said, when asked, how often should we pray? Well, half an hour a day ought to be good, unless you're busy. If you're busy, then you better double it and pray for an hour a day. Does that make sense? No, but guess what? It probably works. So in my life, I'll say, oh God, I'm so busy. I can't go to church today. You know, it's going to take half an hour, then I have lunch, and I want to work out, I have so much to do. You know what? But on those days when I stop and go and take a little time out of my day to to go to daily mass if that's what I want to do that day, and I don't go every day. It helps, you know. And I guess what? The work still gets done, and I might even be more productive. Right? So this idea of stepping back from our work to be reflective, to look at patterns, it's part of our tradition too. So I wanted to share one more thing because it may sound like, oh, I'm saying the Pope is perfect or the Jesuit tradition is perfect, da-da-da. Guess what? It only points to how imperfect we are and how much we can all grow. I asked Scott Allen for his slide. So this is going to be my confession, and then I'm going to transfer it onto the Pope. So, so Scott sent me his slide, and I'm looking at it and said, "Oh, great!" And I'd like to think of myself as a feminist theologian. That was part of what I studied, and I mean, this is embarrassing for me to admit, but so I'm looking at the slide, and I'm looking at this first slide, and I'm reading it. I'm like, the heck, he did some type of typo. What's going on? And it wasn't really, it was out of context. Did you all do this? Yeah. All right, how many of you got stumped by this? A bunch of you? Okay. Well, I'm sitting there saying, what's going on? I thought, well, what is it? Is this, I'm like, is this, oh, this is two men who have a son. Two dads, right? Can you believe I said that? Yes, thank you. So I'm like, oh, then it finally clicked in, right? Of course, the woman is a doctor, right? So, and I couldn't think of that because I'm assuming the doctor's a man. So I'm like, great, I'm a super fan. I'm going to get thrown right out of the feminist club. Because everything they always said about me was absolutely true. I'm man right to the core. Well, then I pulled my assistant, who's a woman, in, an African-American woman, by the way. And I said, so she should be even more liberated and sophisticated than I am. And I said, read this. And she's like, well, it must be the grandfather. I said, see, you did it too. All right? We have a long way to go in this regard, right? So self-awareness, I'm not as good as I thought I was in this regard. I'm still a victim of this. And so is the Pope, you know. One of the critiques of the Pope is he's not doing so good with women. You know, is he really going to, he needs to, women are saying he needs to be a little bit better on this issue. You know what? Yeah. All right, so they haven't seen that he's a change agent, but there's not the change there that people might like to see. But you know what? Women, I have heard women who critique this say, but you know what? The good news is he's got them at the table now. He's inviting women into the conversation. So pretty soon he's going to smell like a woman. You know? Sorry. You know. But no, it's trust the flock. Trust that the sheep will make their mark on the shepherd, and that the shepherd will care for the sheep, and trust it. It's a process. You know? So the good news is that the Pope is inviting all people toward him. Other world religions, people on the margins. He's entertaining questions that weren't entertained before. He's bringing, you know, so maybe he hasn't quite he's not as liberated, you know, maybe the machismo that's part of his culture is just so thoroughly saturated him that he can't think beyond the normal way of, his cultural heritage on understanding the role of women. But you know what? Gets a whole bunch of women around him and talking to him about this, and trust what happens, you know. Now, maybe he'll never change, but, you know, anyway, those are 4 lessons. So there are 2 more. Live in the present, revere tradition, but create the future. And I hope that our discussion tonight has whet your appetite and made you want to read more of the book and help you understand the kind of way he pairs these things. I think we have 5 minutes for questions or comments. Any questions or comments from you?